In the spring of 1924, the expedition vessel Heron's Gate departed the mouth of the Amnok River with a survey crew of 19 men and supplies meant to last 3 months inland. By the 29th day of the expedition, only 4 of those men reached the missionary station at Sinuiju. What happened at the third bend of that river has never been officially recorded. My name is Thomas Caldwell. I was 27 years old when I joined the Heron's Gate as a cartographer's assistant out of Liverpool, England, having spent the previous 4 years mapping tributaries in Burma in one failed season. Charting the interior waterways of French Indochina, I'm 78 years old as I record this testimony. I have told this story only 3 times in my life, and each time I have told it, I have changed the details. Not because I wish to mislead anyone, but because there are parts of it that I still cannot describe in words that other people will believe without concluding that I am either a fraud or a lunatic. I'm neither. I'm an old man who witnessed something on the Amnok River in May of 1924 that has occupied my thoughts through every decade since, surfacing in my dreams without invitation, reshaping itself in my recollection the way current reshapes sediment on a riverbed, always the same sediment, always a slightly altered configuration. I must be exact about what occurred, because exactness is all that remains to me. The Heron's Gate was a shallow draft river steamer approximately 85 feet in length with a beam of 18 feet, powered by a coal-fired engine. She had been constructed in 1902 in Shanghai for survey work along Chinese waterways and had operated for 22 years across the Yangtze system and coastal rivers without noteworthy mishap. In the official logs, her captain was an Englishman named Harold Pritchard, a man of 49, with skin weathered by Asian sun and eyes the color of river stones after rain. He had been navigating the rivers of Manchuria and northern Korea for 13 years and knew those channels the way a shepherd knows his hills. He was not an impulsive man. He was not a man given to imagination. Whatever Pritchard came to believe in those final days, in those terrible hours, I believe as well. We departed from the Rivermouth settlement on the 3rd of May, 1924, bound for the upper reaches west and north toward the highland tributaries. The season had been favorable. The spring melt was producing navigable water levels throughout the northern river systems, and Pritchard had a commission from the Anglo-Korean Survey Company in Seoul that required him to chart previously unmapped bends and established depth markers before the end of July. He intended to work methodically upstream and return with complete survey data. The first 11 days of the expedition were unremarkable in every particular. We moved steadily upriver through late spring conditions, passing through zones of dense forest and occasional settlements. The weather was mild. The current ran moderate at 3 to 5 knots, which the Heron's Gate managed comfortably under steam. We encountered our first local guide, a Korean boatman named Park, on the 9th of May at a riverside village about 140 miles inland, and Pritchard hired him to navigate the upper bends where the charts became unreliable. Park spoke adequate English and knew the river intimately. He piloted us through 2 difficult passages that first day. The crew was satisfied with the progress. The mapping work was proceeding efficiently. There was nothing about those early days that would have caused any sensible man to anticipate what lay ahead. I want to describe the crew in detail because I believe it has significance. These were not green recruits. The Heron's Gate carried 19 souls, including the captain. The first officer was a Scotsman named Robert Finch, who had been working Asian rivers for 12 years. The second officer, a man named Chen Wei, was Chinese, approximately 38 years old, and had navigated the Yangtze system 4 times previously. The surveyors were myself, a Norwegian engineer named Lars Anderson, who stood over 6 feet tall and had shoulders like timber beams, and a Japanese hydrographer named Takeshi Sato, who had grown up studying. Men from England, Scotland, China, Korea, Japan, and Siam, most of them with between 4 and 18 years of river experience. I mention this because I want you to comprehend that when these men grew afraid, when seasoned river workers with decades of combined knowledge began to exhibit the kind of terror I will recount it. It was not the terror of naive or credulous men. It was the terror of men who understood rivers intimately and were facing something that surpassed all their understanding. We worked our way upstream productively through the second week of May. By the 18th of that month, we had charted 7 major bends and established depth markers at 12 critical passages, which represented excellent advancement toward Pritchard's survey obligations. The captain elected to continue further north and west into narrower channels, following reports from another expedition, a French geological survey called the Beaumont Party, that had sent word by runner of significant mineral deposits approximately 60 miles northwest of our position. This decision to venture further northwest is the one I have contemplated most during the 50 years since. Had we remained on the established bends, had Pritchard been content with his progress and turned downstream for Seoul, I would have lived another life. 19 men would have returned home. Instead, we pushed northwest into water. I do not believe any survey vessel had navigated that particular season into a section of the river that was exceptionally deep and entirely removed from any recognized route, and we discovered what we discovered. The first sign that something was different about those waters came on the morning of May 19th. I was on early watch with Park, our Korean guide, and a young Chinese deckhand named Leo who spoke little English but understood river work. The night had been unnaturally still, which was itself peculiar. Rivers do not often go completely motionless. There's almost always some flow, some stirring of the current. But that night, the water was like dark glass from bank to bank. No wind touched the surface, no fish broke the stillness, and the Heron's Gate sat nearly motionless on the current, making perhaps 1 knot under minimal steam. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, Park gripped my shoulder and gestured urgently toward the port side into the water beyond the rail. I looked where he indicated. At first I perceived nothing, then I saw it. Beneath the surface, perhaps 15 to 20 feet down, there was a form. It was substantial. I cannot provide you exact measurements because the light was poor, and the water, though calm, was not entirely transparent at that depth, but the form was elongated, and it was traveling parallel to the vessel on the port side, matching our speed with what seemed like minimal exertion. I observed it for perhaps 30 seconds before it descended and vanished into the depths below. I want to be precise about my response in that moment. I was not instantly terrified. I was perplexed. In my experience, large river creatures occasionally followed vessels, drawn by the engine noise or the wake. Chinese sturgeon, giant catfish, even large river dolphins had been observed accompanying boats I'd worked on previously. My initial thought was that it was a Kaluga sturgeon, perhaps a solitary giant tracking the ship in the deep channel. This was not unprecedented behavior. I recorded what I had observed in the watch log and informed Finch when he came on duty at 7. He listened, made a notation, and said he would relay it to the captain. Nothing further was discussed that day, and we continued our work. The weather remained calm, and the river stayed flat, which Pritchard found advantageous for surveying. We identified a promising tributary entrance in the late afternoon of the 19th, and spent until dusk taking depth soundings at the confluence, the current proving too strong to complete the work before nightfall. Pritchard decided to anchor overnight and finish the measurements at dawn as the tributary appeared to extend deep into the highlands on a navigable bearing. That night, the second indication occurred. I was below in the crew compartment when I felt it. A vibration, not the vibration of the engine which I knew thoroughly after weeks aboard. Not the creaking of the hull straining against anchor, but something altogether different, a low and rhythmic pressure that seemed to emanate from directly beneath the keel, transmitted through the planking of the hull and into the wooden bunks and the floor beneath my boots when I stood. It continued for perhaps 2 minutes and then ceased. I was not alone in sensing it. Leo and 3 other men in the compartment sat upright simultaneously. We looked at one another. No one spoke for a long moment. I pulled on my boots and went topside. The night remained flat and still. The river was black and unmoving under a waning moon. I walked to the rail and peered down into the water on the starboard side. Nothing was visible in the darkness, but I noticed that Anderson, who had the night watch, was already positioned at the port rail, staring down into the water with an expression I had never seen on. His face before it was the expression of a man trying to understand something his mind refused to accept. I walked over and stood beside him. Anderson said to me quietly that he had been feeling the pressure for the past half hour. He said it came and went in waves. He said it felt like something was pushing against the bottom of the hull. The bottom of the hull, those were his words. I stood there with Anderson for perhaps an hour, in the stillness of that river night. and during that hour the vibration returned 3 more times, each occurrence lasting between 1 and 3 minutes, each one seeming to originate from slightly forward of midship on the keel, as if something below was moving deliberately from bow to stern along the bottom of the vessel. Then it stopped completely and did not return that night. In the morning, Pritchard was informed of the vibrations. He came topside and walked the length of the vessel slowly, examining the hull from every angle possible from above the waterline. He asked Anderson and me to describe what we had felt in exact detail. He listened carefully, and then he said that the most likely explanation was that we had anchored over a submerged spring or some underwater geological feature during the night, and that the vibrations were the result of water pressure movement against the hull. This explanation was reasonable. It was the explanation I chose to believe for the next 18 hours because it was the explanation that allowed me to continue working. It did not work well on the night of May 20th. That was the night the shape became visible. We had remained in the same section of river, continuing depth measurements at the tributary confluence. The weather was still unusually calm for the season, and Pritchard was using the conditions to complete detailed soundings that were difficult in stronger current. The vessel lay at anchor overnight with minimal steam, barely holding position against the gentle flow, and the moon was nearly full, and the water, in that extraordinary river stillness, was genuinely translucent with reflected light, so that from the deck one could see down through the surface layer, perhaps 12 or 15 feet. I was on the late watch, midnight to 4, with Sato and a young Korean deckhand named Kim, who had joined the Heron's Gate on his first survey expedition. Kim was perhaps 19 years old and had the kind of open, watchful face that young men carry before experience has carved it into something more guarded. I mention him because he was the one who saw it first. Kim was at the bow, and he called back to us in a voice that was not quite controlled. Just our names, nothing more. Just Caldwell and Sato spoken at a volume that meant come here without raising alarm. We went forward. Below the bow, visible in the moonlit water, there was a shape. It was not the shadow of the vessel. The vessel's shadow fell to the west under that moon. This shape was beneath us in the water at a depth I estimated at between 30 and 50 feet, and it was moving forward at the speed of our minimal drift, with the slow deliberation of something that was not working to maintain the pace. It was simply there, keeping position below us the way a catfish keeps position beneath a floating log. I'm not going to tell you I knew immediately what I was observing. I'm going to tell you the truth, which is that I did not know what I was observing. The shape was substantial. It was roughly horizontal and elongated, thicker through the middle than at the extremities. In the moonlit water at that depth, it had no detail, no texture, only mass and slow undulating movement. My mind went through the obvious possibilities in the way a mind does when it is trying to avoid the conclusion that is forming at its edges. It was a giant sturgeon. It was a large catfish. It was a submerged log we were drifting over. It was a trick of moonlight on the silt-laden water. It was none of those things, and some part of me that had been working rivers since I was barely 20 years old knew that it was none of those things. Sato said nothing for a long time. He stood at the bow rail, looking down with his hands gripping the wood and his face completely motionless. Then he said in a voice that was measured and careful that it was very large. I said yes. He said he had never seen anything that large in these waters. I said I had not either. He said his uncle had told him stories about what lived in the deep river channels. He said his uncle had been a man who did not speak carelessly. I asked him what his uncle had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said his uncle had spoken of the Mulgwizen, the water ghosts. He said his uncle had told him that some rivers, particularly the old rivers in the mountains, held things that were not entirely of this world. He said his uncle had told him that these things were ancient, that they had been in the deep channels since before there were names for the rivers, and that they came to the surface, rarely, only when something disturbed their territories, or when they were drawn by the presence of strangers in waters they consider their own. He said his uncle had told him that when you encountered one from a boat, you did not continue forward. You turned back immediately, and you made offerings at the next village, and you did not speak of what you had seen, except to warn others. Kim was trembling visibly. He asked us in Korean what we should do. Sato translated. I said, we should wake the captain. We woke the captain. Pritchard came topside in his night clothes and looked over the bow rail at the shape below. I watched his face carefully. I saw the same process I had gone through myself, the visible working of a rational mind, trying to construct an ordinary explanation for what it was observing. I saw the moment the ordinary explanations failed. It lasted only a fraction of a second, that moment, and then his face composed itself back into the deliberate calm of a man who commanded other men and understood that his composure was a structural element of their safety. He looked at the shape for perhaps 3 minutes, then he straightened up and said that we would maintain our position until daylight. He said that whatever it was following the vessel at depth and showing no hostile behavior. He said that many large river creatures followed boats, and that there was no reason to abandon our survey work based on an unidentified shape in the water, and he said these things firmly and clearly. I believe he was telling them to himself as much as to us. He went below, and I do not think he slept. The shape was still below us at first light when it finally descended back into depths beyond visibility. In the morning, we examined the water around the vessel carefully and saw nothing. The river was still calm, the engine was running. Everything was ordinary in the daylight and the shape was gone. And men talked themselves back toward normalcy the way men do, by making light of it, by suggesting mundane explanations, by deliberately not discussing it at all. But the conversation I had with Sato stayed with me, the things that were in the deep channels before there were names for the rivers. I have spent the past 50 years reading everything I can find about the folklore and natural history of Korean waterways, and I have read the ethnographic literature on river spirits and water deities. I have read the collected oral traditions and the missionary accounts. I have read the records of Korean scholars and Japanese colonial administrators. I have read the work of anthropologists who studied the Amnok River region specifically, and I have found buried in those readings certain accounts that a man less personally invested might have passed over without attention. The entity known in Korean tradition as Molgwisin, the water ghost, appears in regional folklore throughout the peninsula, but is particularly associated with deep river channels and mountain waterways in the northern provinces. The accounts describe it not as a singular creature, but as a category of river spirit, something that exists in the boundary between the physical and the unseen. In some accounts, the Molgwisin is described as the drowned dead, spirits of those who perished in the water and never received proper burial rites. But in older accounts, particularly those collected from villages along the Amnok and Tumen rivers, the Molgwisin is described differently. It is described as something that was never human, something that lived in the deepest parts of the river long before people settled along its banks. These older accounts speak of enormous serpentine forms that move through the channels like living current. They speak of presences that could be felt through the hull of a boat as pressure and vibration. They speak of shapes that appeared in clear water during full moons, keeping pace with vessels before disappearing into depths that seem to have no bottom. The accounts speak of specific river bends where these encounters occurred most frequently, places where the channel ran particularly deep, places where the current created unusual eddies and where the local guides refused to travel after dark. Places that had names that translated roughly as the bend where the water breathes or the turn where the ancestors turn back. The third bend of the Amnok River, approximately 60 miles northwest of the established survey routes, was known among the river people by a name that Park, our guide, eventually translated for me as the bend where the depth listens. I did not learn this until it was too late. On the morning of May 21st, I was at the port rail watching the water in the early light when Park came and stood beside me. He had been with the expedition for 12 days and had navigated us through difficult passages with quiet competence. He was a man of perhaps 48, lean and weathered, who spoke carefully chosen English and communicated through gesture when words failed. He pointed at the water ahead where the river curved sharply to the northwest. He said the name of the bend in Korean, then translated it, the bend where the depth listens. He said we should not go there. He said the channel beyond that bend was very deep and very old, and that the local people did not take boats through it during certain phases of the moon. I asked him what phases of the moon. He gestured at the sky, still visible above the dawn mist. The full moon. He said during the full moon the water in that bend became strange. He said things rose from the bottom. He said boats that went through sometimes did not come back, and boats that did come back sometimes carried fewer men than had entered. I asked him what he thought lived in that bend. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said in careful English that his father had been a fisherman on this river for 40 years. He said his father had seen the Molgwisin 3 times in his life. He said his father had described it as something between a great eel and a dragon, something that moved through the water with a kind of intelligence that was not animal intelligence, something that seemed to understand that boats carried people inside them, something that seemed in some way he could not explain, to be aware. He said his father had told him that the Mulgwizen was not evil in the way a tiger is not evil. It simply was. It had its territory and its nature. And when you entered its territory, you were accepting certain risks that had nothing to do with weather or navigation or any ordinary danger of river travel. He said, we should turn back. He said we had good survey data already. He said there was no reason to go into the third bend during the full moon. I told him I would inform the captain. I informed the captain. Pritchard listened to my account of Park's warning with the same careful attention he gave to all information. Then he asked me if I believed we were in danger. I told him honestly that I did not know. I told him what we had seen the previous 2 nights. I told him about Sato's uncle's stories. I told him that Park, who had been completely reliable until this moment, was genuinely frightened. Pritchard nodded slowly. Then he said that we had been commissioned to survey these upper reaches specifically. He said the Beaumont Party's geological reports indicated significant mineral deposits in the highlands accessible from the channels beyond the third bend. He said that turning back now would mean abandoning the primary objective of our expedition based on local superstition and 2 nights of unexplained but non-threatening phenomena. He said these things reasonably. He said them the way a man says things when he has already made his decision and is constructing the rationale afterward. He said we would proceed through the third bend in daylight with all hands on watch. He said we would maintain maximum steam and have the anchors ready to deploy if we encountered any difficulty. He said that if we saw anything genuinely threatening, we would reverse course immediately. He asked me if this seemed acceptable. I said yes, because I was 27 years old and wanted to believe that rational planning could protect us from irrational dangers. Park refused to continue with us. He asked to be put ashore at the last village before the third bend. Pritchard agreed and paid him his full contracted fee, plus additional compensation. Park took the money, but before he left the vessel, he said something to Kim in rapid Korean. Kim's face went white. I asked Kim what Park had said. Kim was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Park had told him to watch the hull. He said Park had told him that when the Mulgwizen was near, you could sometimes see the water around the boat become disturbed in a pattern, like something large was circling just below the surface. He said Park had told him that if he saw this pattern, he should tell the captain immediately to reverse the engine and head for shallow water. He said Park had told him that the Mulgwizen did not like to follow into water less than 30 feet deep. We entered the third bend at approximately 10 a.m. on May 21, 1924. The day was clear. The river was running moderate current. The channel was indeed very deep. Our soundings showed depths exceeding 90 feet in the center of the flow, which was exceptional for that river system. The bend curved gradually to the northwest through high forested banks that rose steeply on both sides. The water was darker here, carrying more silt, and the surface had an odd quality I cannot fully describe. It seemed heavier somehow, more resistant, as if the river here was not quite the same substance as the river we had been traveling. We proceeded on steam at half speed, with Finch and Chen Wei taking soundings continuously and myself and Anderson on watch at the rails. Everything was ordinary for the first 15 minutes. Then Kim, who was at the stern, called out in Korean. His voice had a particular quality that made everyone turn immediately. The water behind us was disturbed, not by our wake, which was flowing normally, but by something else. There was a pattern in the surface, a circular disturbance perhaps 40 feet in diameter, moving slowly forward behind the vessel at a distance of maybe 60 feet. It looked like something very large was swimming in a wide circle just beneath the surface. The water in the circle was moving against the current, flowing backward, creating a spiral pattern that caught the light differently than the surrounding river. Pritchard saw it immediately. He called for increased steam. The engine note changed as the boiler pressure built. We began to move faster through the channel. The circular disturbance kept pace with us effortlessly. Then Anderson, who was at the starboard rail, called out. There was another disturbance, this one off the starboard side, between us and the bank. The same circular pattern, the same backward flowing water. Then Sato called. From the port side, another disturbance, port side, forward. We were surrounded by 3 circular patterns in the water, each perhaps 40 feet across, each moving in slow coordination with the vessel, maintaining their positions relative to us as we moved. A prever through the bend. Pritchard made his decision in seconds. He called for full reverse. The engine shuddered and the vessel began to slow, then stop, then slowly begin to move backward down the channel. The circular patterns moved with us, maintaining their positions. Forward, port side, starboard side. We were backing down through the bend at perhaps 3 knots when the first one broke the surface. I do not have adequate words for what I saw. I have tried for 50 years to describe it accurately, and I have failed every time because the thing I saw does not correspond to any category my mind had available. It was not a snake, though. It had the elongated form of a snake. It was not an eel, though. It moved with the undulating motion of an eel. It was not a dragon, though. The Korean word that Kim screamed when he saw it was the word for dragon. What broke the surface forward of our bow was a section of body, perhaps 20 feet long and 3 feet thick, dark gray in color, covered in what might have been scales or might have been something else, something that caught the light like wet stone but moved like living flesh. The section rose vertically from the water to a height of approximately 8 feet, then curved slowly forward as if whatever it was attached to was arching its back beneath the river. There was no head visible. Just that section of body, and possibly large, rising from the circular disturbance in the water and hanging there in the air for perhaps 5 seconds before sliding back beneath the surface without a splash, as if the water simply accepted it back. Then another section broke the surface to starboard, then another to port. Never the head, never the tail. Just sections of body rising and falling in slow sequence, as if something enormous was surfacing in parts, showing us pieces of itself without revealing the whole. Pritchard was shouting orders. Full reverse, keep the engine running, watch the hull. The crew was responding with the automatic efficiency of trained men, but I could see their faces. I could see the same thing in their faces that I felt in my chest. Not quite fear yet, something before fear. Something like understanding that you have entered a situation where your experience and training and tools are no longer sufficient. We continued backing down the channel. The partial surfacings continued around us, always maintaining position, always measured, always deliberate, as if something very large was swimming in circles around our hull, showing itself in sections, making absolutely certain we understood what we were seeing. Then it stopped. All 3 disturbances simply ceased. The water went flat. We continued backing down the channel for another 10 minutes before Pritchard allowed the engine to stop. We drifted in silence for perhaps 5 minutes. Every man on deck was at the rail, watching the water. Nothing moved. The river flowed normally. The surface was undisturbed except by our wake. Then Chen Wei, who had been taking continuous soundings throughout the incident, said quietly that the depth was changing. He said we had been showing 90 feet consistently through the bend. He said we were now showing 40 feet, and it was getting shallower as we drifted backward. Park had been right. It did not follow into shallow water. We did not speak much for the rest of that day. We anchored in a wide section of river where the depth was less than 20 feet, and the banks were low and open. We posted double watch through the night. Nothing approached us. At first light, we turned downstream and began the journey back to the river mouth. We completed no further survey work. We collected no data from the channels beyond the third bend. Pritchard submitted his report to the Anglo-Korean Survey Company, indicating that the upper reaches were unsuitable for navigation due to extreme depth variations and unstable channel conditions. This was not a lie. Exactly. Of the 19 men who entered the third bend that day, 15 completed the journey to the river mouth. 4 did not. They disappeared during the night of May 22nd, while we were anchored in what we believed was safe water. They were simply gone when the morning watch made their count, their bunks empty. No sounds had been heard, no disturbance noted. The river had taken them silently while we slept. I do not know if they were taken by the Mulwizen, or if they simply chose to leave, unable to face whatever it was we had seen. I do not know if they drowned or if something else happened to them. I know only that 4 men went into the water in the darkness and did not come back. And I know that what I saw on the third bend of the Amnok River in May of 1924 was not imagined, was not misidentified, was not explained by any scientific framework I have since encountered. I know that there are things in the deep channels of old rivers that were there before we named the rivers, and I know that some of those things are still there, watching, waiting, listening in the depths.